Hi, this is Amith Gupta. I'm a staff attorney here at CCF, and I'm very proud to introduce our very distinguished panel. First and foremost, we have the filmmaker, Assia Boundaoui. We also have our Terry Albury, who is one of the whistleblowers who's revealed from the other end of the spectrum the policies that were that we sort of saw in this film, as well as Joshua Dratel, who's criminal defense attorney for the prosecution of his brave act of whistleblowing. Unfortunately, due to technical problems, I am not able to join the other panelists in person. However, I will be trying to moderate this discussion over by audio. So I would like to welcome all of our distinguished panelists. I'd also like to advise everyone else who's watching to consider submitting questions into the text box there, and you should be able to join our discussion. So, and foremost, I'd like to welcome our filmmaker. Of life in the Muslim community and the destructive effect of surveillance and the fears that it's caused. So, Assia, I want to ask you first, how has the FOIA suit proceeded since the end of the film, and have you been able to obtain more information through your FOIA requests?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for hosting this event. I'm happy to be here. So, the film ends. By the way, also I wanted to mention that we heard that there were technical difficulties with the streaming and that the film got cut off early. And just to say that, CCF will be sending a link to everyone so you can watch, I think maybe something like the last 15 minutes of the film. But, the end of the film, I'm receiving the first batch of FOIA documents that I won through the FOIA lawsuit. And the lawsuits, the FOIA litigation started in 2016, and it's now 2021, and it's still going strong. It's been a long case. Every month I get thousands of pages of records sent to me. And, it felt like, we had won this battle in this longer war for transparency. But at the end of the day, these documents are more than 75% redacted. And so, now my current work is dealing with that, like going through this entire Freedom of Information process, and in the end, still not being able to compel the FBI to be transparent about what is now something like a 30-year-old investigation. So the journey continues. We're working. Currently, I'm working on something called the Inverse Surveillance Project, where I'm in a fellowship at the MIT Open Documentary Lab, where we're thinking about how we can compel technology or use technology to compel a radical transparency in government records instead of, just requesting it from the same agencies that conducted these investigations, and that are invested in the secrecy that shrouds all of these documents. The journey continues.
That's great. I think one of the more inspiring aspects of the film was the presence of people from kind of all age groups and genders in the community, insisting at the Speak Out event where you had these blow-up pictures of some of the documents that you'd been able to obtain, insisting on their right to protection and their refusal to collaborate with the FBI moving forward. So I guess I would ask, what do you think people in this community should do in order to stand up to protect their rights from the intelligence agencies moving forward? I know you mentioned that project. Is that something that everyone can plug into? Are there other things that people in the community should be doing on their own if they're located in different parts of the country? What do you think?
I think there are a lot of layers to the answer to this question. And I think on, just like a larger level, the film took 5 years to make, and it was really a transformative journey. And I think one of the things I came out of it understanding was that, you know, like you can't get neither truth nor really any kind of restoration or restorative justice from the same agencies that caused the problem and continue to cause the problem. So my approach, you know, though I went through this FOIA battle for so long, I've realized like that's not where the repair will happen, or even where, that's not the strategy really. And I think that the strategy is building power within the community itself. I mean, there's a lot to be said about the kind of shame people internalize, the deep collective trauma that happened in the community that people still live with, because these investigations have continued in other forms over these past, 20, 30 years. And so, building power, I think there's a lot that what, the immigrant Muslim community in my neighborhood went through is very similar to what many, communities, from the Black Muslim community to the, Black community in COINTELPRO, the Black Liberation Movement, the Puerto Rican Independence Movement, the American Indian Movement. There are many, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color that were organizing and that were institutionalizing, they're organizing that fell under very similar investigations and surveillance operations. So understanding that continuum and building power with these other communities and finding safety outside, of the FBI and law enforcement within our own communities, I think is how we stay safe.
One part of the film kind of shows you confronting one of the kind of traditional leaders in the Muslim community who was defending the FBI, even when the FBI agents denied that the very existence of the kinds of investigative practices that your film proved. I mean, I wanted to get your point of view on to what extent do you think that kind of U.S. Muslim community leadership complacency has permitted the FBI's harassment? Do you think that plays a role?
I mean, certainly, and the film draws on that. I think there's this kind of respectability politics that a lot of folks in the immigrant Muslim community leaned on really heavily. This idea that as long as they had a seat at the table, that they could protect their community. And for whatever reason, that strategy was very misguided. There might have been a lot of good intentions. Folks came from countries, these immigrants. Arab immigrants specifically came from countries where there was mukhabarat and surveillance and all of this kind of stuff happening. So they came with their own layers of baggage and trauma. And so the response to it was kind of like, hey, we're good citizens, look at us, we're not terrorists. And, for like more than a decade, we've defined ourselves like in the negative, we're not terrorists, rather than like, draw on all of the nuances and complexities of who we actually are. So yeah, that's been a strategy, like this idea that you're inviting the FBI into the front door while they're sneaking in through the back door. They're making public statements that they don't spy on mosques or in mosques, while records show that they've been doing that since the 80s. So yeah, there are a lot of people within the community that are critical of the leadership, and specifically in my community, and I know it's like this in a lot of states around the country, of this kind of, quote unquote cooperation and this like respectability kind of politics strategy. And there are a lot of layers to why I think that happens, specifically in like immigrant Muslim communities. But yeah.
I also wanted to make sure I asked you, I thought one of the most notable parts of the film is that you said that some people in your community didn't recognize the symptoms of schizophrenia that somebody had because everyone was so paranoid as a result of the real surveillance practices that they weren't able to recognize signs of schizophrenia. How would you describe overall the effect of government surveillance on the mental health of people in the Muslim community?
Yeah, I think that's really deep. I think that, we live in this like perpetual state of heightened paranoia that certain things became so normal that you wouldn't recognize. And then also it's a very strange irony that the way schizophrenia shows up in the United States is people afraid of the government, afraid of being spied on by the government. And interestingly, I found out that that's like a culturally specific thing. Like in Africa, in North Africa, people with schizophrenia don't have these ideas that the government is watching or that they're under surveillance. Like this is a very culturally specific manifestation of a mental health disorder in the United States. And the layers of that are really fascinating. Like, where does that come from? And the culture that kind of spawns that. But I think that there are a lot of, there's a deep collective trauma, and you can literally draw lines from the effects to the causes. When you sow informants in communities, when you cause this deep distrust in like very tight-knit communities, what happens? What fractures? So you can like draw lines from, some of these collective traumatic effects to the actual tactics that the FBI has used. And I would also say the other layer to that is that the FBI is running psych ops, and from COINTELPRO there have been specific psychological operations that are happening within the surveillance, like the use of very obvious physical surveillance in a neighborhood. This is meant for people to see and control their behavior accordingly. And this whole metaphor of the panopticon that I make in the film is related to that. This idea that you're under such heavy surveillance, you don't even need to see an agent anymore. You start, your behavior changes, the way you move through space, the way you think, the way you walk and talk to people. You're watching yourself, and that's insidious. And I say, like, if you look at the COINTELPRO documents and you read them carefully, there's explicit lines where the FBI states its explicit purpose is to make the Panthers so crazy they're discreditable. They're not, they sound discredited to the public, that they sound crazy by planting, by doing very specific psychological operations. So this has been a tactic that the FBI has used for a long time. So there's no coincidence that there are mental health effects in these communities with these, long-term surveillance operations.
Thank you so much for that. I want to shift gears to speak to Terry. First of all, Terry, I want to emphasize that, like everyone else in our community of civil rights lawyers, of Muslims, of Black and brown people, we're all deeply thankful for the sacrifice that you made of giving up essentially your career and spending several years in prison for being a person of conscience and a whistleblower. The leaks that you provided to journalists documented, among other things, the low levels of justification given by FBI agents to engage in the kinds of investigatory processes that we saw in the film, as well as the fact that they really didn't bar racial or religious profiling. In your own words, can you briefly summarize for us what those documents said and how those policies were implemented?
Well, thank you for having me first off. And also, I definitely was quite inspired by your film and what you put out there and the truth that you told, and just really giving a voice to this community, other communities, of these tactics. Because it's important, it's, I think a lot of people feel as though they're almost, you talk about the schizophrenia and the paranoia and, this belief that what you assume to be happening is not really factual, and there is context to that, and it does happen. As far as your question, I mean, I need to be delicate, obviously, because there's legal parameters that I have to follow, and if I confirm certain things, I mean, you talked about the documents that were disclosed, they're out there, and for me personally, I would probably put myself in a challenging situation legally if I make any confirmation about what is out there. I mean, we all know what's been exposed. We can read, any number of media outlets and see that. But as far as, going into those details, that's just probably not in my best interest at this juncture. Not that I came on here to stonewall you and kind of redirect, but it's just I need to be a little bit more methodical in that regard right now.
Sorry, that was on mute. the New York Times article that was recently published, we're going to send a copy of that out to everyone who signed up, as well as the film itself and some other documents. In the New York Times exposition on your leak and on your life and on your background, there's a discussion that came up that racism against Black as well as Black and or Muslim people that you witnessed was the driving factor in kind of you making the sacrifice that you did. To the extent that it's legally permissible for you to do so, how would you say that what you saw from the viewpoint of being a spy, as opposed to maybe the viewpoint that was depicted in the movie from the point of view of the community, kind of drew you to this conclusion that clearly in the film there were other FBI agents that said no, there was no racism, there was no discrimination?
I mean, I would say broadly speaking, I mean, what I witnessed, I mean, there's different layers, right? I mean, I think in the beginning, the narrative was quite simplistic, you know, African-American FBI agent disgruntled about racism. So he makes a series of disclosures about racism. And it's just, you know, I think that was easy and comfortable for a lot of people to just kind of wrap their minds around. But for me, it was a lot more complicated than that and very specific as far as what was being done. And, you know, Janet discussed that extensively, she and I, in our conversations again about just the overall approach of, you know, as the film clearly spells out, I mean, this perpetual panopticon that the Muslim community has to live under perpetually for the sole reason that they happen to worship a different God than their fellow countrymen, that they happen to come from a different country, that, you know, the collectively, you know, decide that they're the enemy. And so for me, it was more of a, what is, you know, I talk a lot about, you know, intelligence. This is this broad nebulous term that gets thrown around quite a bit. And the manner in which the government justifies their actions and their tactics in these communities from an intelligence standpoint and from a position that they can justify their activities because they're gathered intelligence, and whatever that term means, right? It sounds very novel. It makes you feel kind of warm and fuzzy, but the reality, it's, you know, just a comprehensive form of harassment and fear and intimidation that's employed within this community specifically for the sole purpose that, you know, that's the bread and butter of the FBI, of the intelligence community, you know, and it's not just them. I mean, it's the entire, you know, the terrorism industrial complex, right? These organizations that have built their name and have sort of carved out their existence by promoting this false narrative that, you know, there's a terrorist in every community, that mosques are secretly this hotbed for radicalization, and just a lot of just these fallacies that people haven't really questioned, and they just take at face value because they're so accustomed to being spoon-fed and manipulated by the state, by the media, by all other entities, you know, and it's just, you know, I think it's incumbent upon us now, you know, 20 years later, to really ask these hard questions and really examine what is being done in our name and why and its impact, and not just taking the position that, you know, well, it's because, you know, we were attacked and therefore it's justified and we should just suspend any sense of you know, law and honor and duty and you know, justice, what real justice means, right? It's not, there shouldn't be like this exception kind of carved out and, you know, we apply it to everyone except, you know, people from these countries, everyone except people with this religious faith. So hope that answers the question, but kind of went on.
Not at all. I'm actually we've had some technical issues galore. This is Lina Alarian, the executive director of CCF. Hello, everybody. I think we lost Amith, so we may have somebody stepping in because I currently don't have childcare. But in the meantime, I have the questions that he prepared, and I can continue until somebody else may take over. I'm really sorry. This is such an important panel. We're so honored to have you all, and I'm really sorry that the technical difficulties kind of put a damper on this important discussion, but it's been great to hear from you all. Just to continue with you, Terry, and I completely understand the sensitive nature of the discussion and, you know, the documents that are out there. So just to continue with Amith's questions about kind of your background and, you know, the influences in your life that, you know, shaped your thinking and your understanding of everything that was happening. So I guess Amith wanted to ask you, some parts of your family came from activist backgrounds, including those who belonged to organizations that were the target of illegal and violent repression in the past, including the Black Panthers, which of course was mentioned in the article. You went the other direction. To what extent do you think that the history of the Black Panthers and other Black and brown activist organizations and the illegal repression they face shaped your eventual disgust with FBI practices, if at all, and what was going on and the things that you had witnessed?
You know, I always tell, you know, when Janet and I were talking through this whole process, you know, I told her that I'm very complicated, right? I think that it's easy to sort of have this one-dimensional view of, you know, our humanity and what a person is. And so, you know, I mean, there were obviously varying factors in my life that sort of shaped me into who I became and who I am to this day. And I think, you know, we're always evolving in many ways. You know, I would say that that was obviously an important data point in my life. And it definitely, I don't know if it sort of launched me, you know, eventually on this path, but it's something that I always was aware of. You know, it's not that like, I didn't enter the government with this like this illusion and these rose-colored glasses about, oh, the FBI, they're the white knights and they're gonna, you know, save the world, right? But I think on some level, you know, I understood the past and what was done in a different era, and that obviously was extremely problematic and destructive to a lot of communities, and has no place whatsoever. And so, you know, as I evolved and, you know, grew and really sort of had this intellectual curiosity about life, about people, I mean, I would just say one thing overall was just, you know, this belief in our fundamental shared humanity, right? I mean, I think we often talk about that, but I mean, it is so true, right? And just the intersectionality of everyone, you know, the collective we, and this idea that, you know, because I have a position, because I have a certain level of authority or educational background, whatever it is, that gives me the right to demonize a certain group, to people, you know, hold them in such low regard because my government has decided that they are undeserving of certain freedoms and you know, abilities that are shared by so many others. And so I think that, coupled with just, you know, really the time that I spent in the Muslim community, you know, I mean, from being very young in the FBI at 20, 21, 22, right? And what I saw, and then just, you know, really trying to understand it all and what it meant. And then eventually becoming an agent and traveling and going to community centers and really trying to connect with people on that human level and realizing that it was all BS, right? I mean, it was just this massive Ponzi scheme that the government has created, and they have to maintain it, you know, and their sole focus today, you know, they'll have these manufactured investigations, right? They'll have these really great cases that they want to parade someone before, you know, the court of public opinion and say, look, we caught one, you know, proves our position is correct. They are all bad. But the reality, you're dealing with an individual or many individuals that, you know, I mean, there are other realities at play that cause that. And so, you know, I mean, I love Howard Zinn, right? And as like a historian, and I read a lot about him growing up, even in the FBI. And, you know, he often talked about terrorism and war and what that means. And, you know, what I'll never forget is what he said, you know, how can you have a war on terrorism when war itself is terrorism, right? And it's so simple, but it's like, do you not understand that, right? And you know, to this day, like, you know, yeah, maybe the war in Afghanistan is over officially, right? But the reality is just the collective, the overarching war on terrorism has not stopped. It's, it's being waged in this country. It's still being targeted at brown, black immigrant communities from all over the globe that happen to profess a certain faith that we find objectionable. And that's the problem. And that should not be sanctioned at all. But it is, because again, like, you know, for whatever reason, we have this love affair with the government and what they're doing, because, you know, well, it's them, you know, and perhaps maybe on some level, I mean, you know, people sanction it because if the attention is directed in that direction, you know, perhaps then they'll say, well, they won't look at our communities, but, you know, shared humanity, right? We're all in the same community, and so we have to recognize that. And I mean, that's probably a pie in the sky kind of view of the world, but I don't know. I think that matters. So.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. To shift a little bit to Josh, you've represented a lot of defendants in national security cases who were often the target of these lengthy FBI investigations. How was representing Terry, who, of course, you know, became a target himself of the FBI in a, you know, much different way? How was representing him as a whistleblower different in your experience?
Well, it's different in the sense that Terry, as an insider, had the ability to speak with great authority in terms of his experience and how the system is designed in the way to propagandize and to discriminate. And it's not a bug, it's a feature. And in that context, it's so important to have that confirmed in many respects, because obviously I've had a lot of clients who, you know, who expressed a lot of what outsiders may think is paranoia, but in fact, it's really gaslighting by the government in many respects, in the context of how the lack of transparency conceals what's going on. And so in Terry's situation, to reveal that is very important. And also in the context of the way that people, you know, from outside and are looking at it as why distinctions are drawn in certain contexts, as if there is some factual or principled basis for the government doing X versus Y, when in fact it's not. It's really a program that doesn't make distinctions between those for whom there might be a valid basis for investigation and those whom the government just sees as opportunities for investigation. And in the context of intelligence, something that Terry talked about as well, which is one of the important aspects of Terry's situation, is that post 9/11, almost every law enforcement agency recast itself in many respects, including the FBI, quite explicitly as an intelligence agency. So to try to sell it as not something that is an overreach, but something that's essential for protection. And so selling it that way, the propaganda of it was very powerful for a nation not only full of fear, but also conditioned to be propagandized by popular movies, popular television, news media, all of that, politicians. It's a perfect storm, unfortunately, unleashed in this context that had a tremendous impact on communities.
And what was your general reaction to the media response to these leaks at the time where, especially during the Trump administration, we saw a lot of mainstream, including liberal media, sort of worship of the FBI and James Comey. And what kind of role do you think that played in, what should have been really outrage to these, finally, the things that we had suspected and sort of known ourselves, and as you called it, gaslighting, were finally confirmed in writing, and it just didn't get the attention that it deserved. And I just wanted to get your response to that.
It's a tremendous missed opportunity. I agree. The sort of liberal media, the typical what you'd consider people who for decades had, if not attacked the FBI, but at least had some level of skepticism, were busy defending the FBI. And the same thing happened in the FISA context with the Carter Page scandals about that. Another terrible missed opportunity to really drive home the need for reform. But instead, there was this circling of the wagons because of the Trump factor. And we're seeing it now with January 6th as well. I mean, the defense of some of the surveillance, geofencing warrants, all of these things that are going on that are now deemed appropriate because of the nature of the target. And to me, that doesn't make the distinction for me. It's still a dangerous bit of government activity that is guaranteed to ultimately be turned. It already has been on, other types of dissidents who generally are not aligned with law enforcement the way right-wing organizations are, because they're basically part of law enforcement.
Yeah. And, have you been following also the big budget, the massive increase in the budget that was given to the Capitol Police to start opening up offices in California and Florida? And what does that mean for communities of color and other groups that may be targeted by this? What does Capitol Police have to do with these other states away from the actual Capitol?
It means that people who express disagreement with official policy are going to be the subject of surveillance, are going to be the subject of investigation, and are going to have their lives affected quite adversely throughout, whether it's professionally or whether it's their family life, their social life. They are going to find themselves on an island in many respects, just as the Muslim community found that this kind of focus isolates people because everybody feels it's toxic and they're radioactive. And the average person, for completely understandable reasons, is afraid to be linked to that. So the easiest way to avoid that is to avoid the people who are being targeted. So it's a problem that achieves a certain result without much effort, unfortunately.
Right. And to ask Terry about that question, who, in your experience, what kinds of people will be targeted by this when you have a massive increase in budget? I just imagine it's a sort of low-hanging fruit that they would go after. But, is there really this threat that the government needs to put down or confront at all after this riot?
No, I would say absolutely not. I mean, it's, what was it? Trevor Aronson wrote that book years ago, The Manufactured War on Terrorism. And in many ways, we're seeing that, absolutely. I mean, the Capitol Police, what rational basis do they have to open a satellite office in California or anywhere else? It's a lot like the NYPD, and their effort to sort of justify this counterterrorism program and link it, and travel all throughout the 5 boroughs and then travel overseas and really present themselves as like this new front in the global war on terrorism. And so, I mean, it's the same thing all over again. We've seen this before. And so these Capitol Police officers, I mean, in my opinion, they'll be most likely directed to traditional terrorism type investigations, which will, again, historically, as we've seen, target Black and brown and Muslim communities. That's the default, right? I mean, terrorism, the reality has we've seen through not just, the, as whatever they want to call it, the liberal media, but, even those in the center, domestic terrorism, as we've seen over the past 20 years, has been connected by the far right. But again, that's not really the comfortable, and that's not, I guess, the way that the system would like to believe. And so it's easy to redirect those resources to what is convenient and comfortable and what everyone understands, And so that's what I see happening once again, is these police officers being used for that purpose.
Yeah, totally. To switch back to Josh, Assia's film shed light on how, while many Muslims and others are harassed and investigated based on their identity, very few cases proceed to serious prosecutions. How, in your view, is that reflected in the cases that you've defended?
Well, I've not only defended cases that reached a prosecution, but I've represented a fair number of people who were targeted for investigation. And then the question is very delicate as to how to get out, get off that list, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And it's a delicate process because there's a question as to whether to submit to an interview and clear the air to avoid it altogether. And different clients have different approaches. And I represented people who were regulars at mosques in the metropolitan area in New York who were approached because of some distant past transgression that could be used to blackmail them into cooperation. Mm. And their refusal to do that was very traumatic because it exposed them to retaliation by the government, by the FBI. And that is always a very difficult decision. It's a personal decision for people to make. I know other people have gone the opposite direction when they became sources of information for the government. So and what Assia was talking about initially is very important, because by pitting people in the community against each other, it creates a fracture in the community itself that essentially does the work of the government for it, but not in a healthy way. And it's not healthy for the community. It's not healthy for society as a whole, and certainly not healthy for the individuals who are affected by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And just to bring it back to Assia, can you tell us a little bit about the project that you're working on now? Because I know that the story didn't end with your film, and you sort of just uncovered the tip of the iceberg, and the document similar to the documents that were released from the FBI. That's always just the tip of the iceberg, and it's just it goes so deep that really none of us know to what extent, and of course there's very little transparency. Maybe Josh can tell us a little bit later how a person can even end up on a list. And I know you mentioned it could be some random past transgression, or Terry can give us that insight. But first, I want you to tell us and our viewers about the project you're working on.
Yeah, sure. I talked a little bit about the transparency part of this, of the inverse surveillance project, like dealing with the FOIAs and trying to compel a transparency, that we'll never actually get from the government. But the other end of the project is actually, it's this idea that this kind of realization that we don't need to see the redacted records to know what happened, because we were on the other end of these documents. People know on an intimate level what happened because they've experienced it, individually and collectively. And so we've been thinking a lot about healing, and there's a deep relationship between truth and healing. You see it in truth and reconciliation commissions, and I think that so part of the work is thinking of the redaction, like these documents as a canvas, and the redacted space as a place of opportunity for us to tell the community story. So, we're collecting a community archive in Bridgeview, and we're asking people to like co-create this with us. And, we're working on a physical installation where we'll have the community's videos and archive that comes out of these, redacted space. And the idea is also that in creating our own narrative, and not even trying to respond to the documents, but superimpose our narrative on top of them. And doing that collectively, like that is going to facilitate healing in our community, that people can talk out loud about things that they've only whispered about for such a long time, that you can feel powerful looking at these like very violent documents. There's something to be said, like there's a violence in the collection of them. There's a violence in, and then in retaining them in a perpetuity and sharing them with other agencies like forever. So like once you have a record, it stays. And so like the reaction to the violence of that is, how do we reclaim the narrative, and how do we use these documents, that maybe in the process of this creation we can heal, we can start talking about things, and we can build power. So that's the work now.
Amazing. I can't wait to see that. I'm going to ask one last question, which I will direct at both Josh and Terry, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Neda, who's also here, and she's been collecting questions from our audience. They have a lot of good questions for you guys. So I will sign off after that, but I wanted to extend my deep thanks again and apologize for the technical difficulties today. But that's that post-pandemic Zoom life. So what, in your view, Josh, and then Terry, is the best way for people in the community to protect themselves from investigations that criminalize behavior that is normal, harmless, or even positive, such as charity or other First Amendment activities?
I think that there are a couple of things. One is take advantage of resources in the community, organizationally, culturally, that are positive in the community. Try to trust people. The suspicion, like I said, only divides and does the government's work for it. I think solidarity is through trust and transparency, and to be conscious of traps that exist in the, and I know that it means some restriction, but it also means just having a little bit of caution so that you don't fall into a trap that is being. So, for example, a lot of people come on the radar for social media posts, and I'm not saying people shouldn't express themselves on social media, but do understand that your language is important, and try to moderate it and keep it moderate, so that when I say moderate, I don't mean moderate in opinion, but I mean moderate in action, in terms, because otherwise you're going to be looked at differently. You're going to get reported by someone who sees it, and that's going to be, so just a little bit of that restraint can help you get your message out and keep you in a context where you can be productive and not on the defensive.
Thank you. Absolutely. And so, Terry, just from having seen the way that, the FBI and these agencies operate as far as, criminalizing just normal behavior or looking at people with suspicion, what is it that people can do to protect themselves? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe the question itself is flawed in some way, because the behavior on the other end is incorrect. I mean, this entire model and how it looks at us. And I know, Josh, that's what you were saying. Of course, you have to protect yourself and acknowledge the realities while still being critical of those conditions that are set for us. But just wanted to hear your kind of thinking around all of this as far as behavior that's seen as criminal.
And you're right. I mean, I think that's the challenge, right? And so, I mean, Assia, in her film, she really stressed the importance of transparency, and illuminating these issues, and to the point where the community does not feel so paranoid and that they adopt this position like that their beliefs are just a fallacy, right? And so I think these films like yours and just efforts to educate the community comprehensively to the point where you're confirming and you're giving a voice to the point where it's not I am completely misguided for believing this. Like, I actually can confirm this, and I'm going to say it. I'm going to speak it out loud, and I'm going to challenge, the system and hold them to account in my own way. I think that's the first step, and it's hard because the FBI. Their bread and butter is informants, right? And they often talk about within the organization that you live and die by your informants, and so there's definitely a calculated effort underway that historically has been the case and is still today to infect the Muslim community with as many informants as possible. And that practice is still being employed as we speak. And so it's hard, right? You don't want to engage in this self-censorship at all times, but you just have to be aware of these realities and recognize that person that's trying to engage you in illicit conversations out of you might be a double agent. He might be someone who's in the pocket of the federal government for nefarious purposes. But as far as any engagement with the government, my position is just plead the fifth when in doubt. Just don't say anything. If they come knocking on your door, do not talk to them. That is your right, and you should exercise that. By all means, because nothing that you say can serve you at all. And so it's just when in doubt, just remain silent and don't speak unless you have an attorney present.
Thank you so much, Terry. Hi, everyone. My name is Neda. I'm with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. I'll be taking over for the last 9 minutes. So Assia, I was going to ask you a couple of questions from the audience. Just with the last few minutes that we have, I thought these were good questions. And you kind of touched up on this a little bit in the beginning. And says, powerful documentary. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together. Question for Assia, what impact did making this documentary have on you? So I know we talked about like the mental impact of surveillance in general, but I guess, we see towards the end of the documentary, the emotional toll and the personal effect that filming this has had on you. So can you just speak more to that?
Yeah, I like I mentioned, it was really a transformative process. It was a 5-year-long process making the film, and seems like a life's work dealing with these documents and trying to understand what happened and move forward collectively. So there have been a lot of changes on a lot of levels. I think that specifically the people that were investigated in my community, a lot of them had no idea that these investigations were connected, or that there was this larger operation that was happening. People felt very alone in what happened and had rarely talked about their experience of being targeted. I think Josh hinted at this a little bit, that what happens when you're investigated is that people are afraid of the association, because this association is used to criminalize people all the time. So, it's a terrible thing that happens. It's a really alienating thing that happens for the person and the family of the person targeted. And so making the film specifically in the community and talking out loud about this thing and, connecting all the dots and showing how these investigations were connected and part of this like longer historical continuum was really powerful, specifically for those, some of those families that were targeted, that they were, that there's a lot of shame that grows in the silence. And being able to talk about these stories out loud and think about also, like, there's a whole ripple effect. There's one person targeted, their family is right there in the center. And then there's all of these ripples to the community that happen. There are all these people that are harmed and affected from it. Every single person that's targeted has multiple ripples. So this is how this collective like harm happens also. So Yeah, it was a very powerful thing. We had like a community screening shortly after we made the film, and like 500 people from the neighborhood came out to see it for the first time. And it was just an incredible conversation that we had, and people talking out loud about this thing that hadn't before and talking to each other. It was very emotional, and it felt like, this is the start of approaching this in a different way. Because I think that we've internalized, like collectively as a community, a lot of shame, and talking out loud about a thing busts shame, and there's like a lot of power in that.
Thank you so much, Assia. Yeah, that's amazing, and I think that's honestly one of the most powerful things that comes from these films is the conversations that they create and stir up within the communities, especially when it comes to these types of conversations in which we haven't been allowed to have them. And like you said, it busts shame. So I guess another question that I from the audience says, so what was the hardest part going through the process of making this documentary? I mean, we saw barrier after barrier, but I guess just as far as making the film for you, what was the most difficult thing to overcome?
I don't know which one I should pick to tell the story about, but there were many challenges in making the film. I think one, like just to stay on theme with some of what we talked about in terms of like gaslighting, that really hits a chord with me because, I had multiple like off the record interviews with FBI agents who didn't want to appear on camera, supervisory, SSAs, people that work directly on Operation Vulgar Betrayal. And, each time I experienced this like severe gaslighting. I think at one point an agent told me like, I'm a ghost buster, I'm chasing ghosts. This like, your community is paranoid because you guys are actually paranoid. What you think happened didn't happen. It didn't happen on the scale you thought it happened. And like the FOIA track was one of 3 investigative tracks I had. I was, applying and requesting Freedom of Information Act requests. I was trying to track down and find out all the agents that worked on the specific investigation and to contact them. And I was also, reaching out to informants. And, the idea was like one of these tracks, hopefully, like would lead to a clear understanding of what happened in an investigation. But yeah, there's like, there's all of this like anonymity that the agents wanted to hide behind. And there's this consistent, denial that what you think, that this happened or didn't happen. And it wasn't really until, I got a letter saying there are 33,000 documents in this investigation that I was like, okay, this was massive. This was, it is like, we're not crazy. This did happen. And enough of us have experienced this to know that. But yeah, there was this constant real difficulty when talking with agents, talking to former prosecutors, even of this like constant gaslighting that I was completely off the right track. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Assia. I know we only have you for 3 more minutes, but we'll continue on for a little bit longer with Josh and Terry just to make sure there's no questions for you guys, or maybe to have you guys go back and address some other things. But before you go, if you can just like maybe, I guess, give a few words about what community members should do moving forward, like what type of actions can people take? I guess somebody asked, how do we throw a wrench in this system? I'm paraphrasing, of course. But yeah, so you can just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about like this idea of building power within your own community, that, the thing that happens when you are under investigation or you feel that you're under surveillance is you become alienated. You're afraid to communicate because those communications are being recorded, and it really isolates you, and you become like physically petrified, which is like to be cast into stone, and so you don't move. And that's the worst thing that you can do in this moment. And the idea is to move, is to talk to people, is to make records of what is happening. Like at the least, like this, I've experienced this happen on this day. Like it's just in your head. This is happening, and tracking it and taking notes of it, talking to people about it, talking to organizers, being in community and strengthening your relationships is the best way to like go through this. And, I say in the film that I'm like, a little like cynical that I can ever protect myself from being surveilled. That that our community is going to continue to be surveilled for a really long time, and that the power that we have is like surveillance is this violent one-way gaze, and you can disrupt that gaze by saying, I can watch back and I'm going to look at you, and that it's not a one-way gaze anymore, and it disrupts it. Even if it doesn't end the surveillance, it's a way to disrupt it. And there's amazing, this idea of surveillance, this idea of citizen undersight, which is the opposite of oversight. There's amazing groups like Cop Watch that have been doing this for a really long time, to watch the watchers, that there's a power in that, like, and in building in community and doing that and not being alone in it is really, really important, because a lot of the tactics also are meant to isolate you. And the idea is like the opposite of surveillance and the opposite of the panopticon is not only to watch back, but to look around, at the people that, with us that are being watched, and to build those relationships and build them strong. Because that's the way, like that this is going to continue happening. And this is how we protect ourselves. And this is how we like stay sane through it, and build power actually through this.
Thank you so much, Assia. FH says, Assia, your mom is great in the documentary, and I agree with her. Yes, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely evening. We're going to continue just for a few more minutes with Josh and Terry. But yeah, be safe. Have a good night, Assia. Take care.
Thank you guys so much, and thank you, Josh and Terry, for your words. I appreciate it very much. Have a nice night, you guys.
All right. Josh and Terry, do you guys want to also kind of touch up on what Assia just spoke about? It was a very powerful statement, and I couldn't agree with it more. I don't know if you guys have more to add to it, or also just to, I guess, answer the question of, I guess, what do people do now, or how can community members act?
Well, I'll take that. I think the idea of sharing is very important, because I think that, as Assia said, it's a traditional therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think it applies here in the sense that also people, if they don't share, they often think that they're the only person going through it. That maybe because no one else is talking about it and they're not sharing it with people, that maybe there's something different about them, something wrong with them, something to feel guilty or ashamed about. When you share it in the community, you find that a lot of people feel the same way and have had the same experiences. And you don't want to normalize it, but you do want to socialize it, essentially, so that you can come up also with a common plan of action, rather than on your own, where it's really not very effective. As a community, there can be effective action. As individuals, it's much more difficult.
Thank you so much, Josh. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think talking about, everything, all like, the hard experiences, I guess, just makes it so that you're in community with others, but then also people know that it's happening to other people. It's also like a way of, I guess, documenting when it happens in the community, somebody else knows about it. I guess, Terry, I have a question for you along the same lines. How do people stay safe when building community? You said that the informants are the bread and butter of the FBI, and I guess there is a lot of distrust in the community, just as far as we've been burned so many times. So I guess, how do people cultivate the relationships that they need to cultivate while also remaining safe, or doing their homework?
I mean, I think the first stage, obviously, like, as you ended, is doing the homework, right? Really educating yourself with the facts, because the facts are there, readily available for everyone in black and white. And so, there's been a great deal of research done, not just by like Assia, but other organizations, from you guys at the CCF, the Brennan Center, the ACLU. I mean, just to go across the board of people that have done the work to really give voice to these realities and educate the community of what they should do when confronted with this, whether it's crossing the international border and you have to deal with CBP, or whether you are at the you're in your community and the FBI comes and knocks at your door. I mean, just, again, knowing your rights and being unafraid to exercise them, and confidently exercise them, knowing that you have these rights in this country, and a lot of people often talk about, with the Muslim community specifically, this reality of many come from countries where there is a secret police and they have to live in fear, and the FBI capitalizes on that fear, knowing that you feel vulnerable in this country and that you have to be on your guard. And so just, again, knowing the safeguards that are in place and being willing and able to, again, exercise your rights and saying no. I'm not going to engage with you. I am going to contact an attorney or whatever I need to, and not feeling as though that is going to somehow cause you to, fall further on the radar. And if it does, so what, though? I mean, again, you're already on the radar, right? So playing ball with them is not going to help.
Thank you so much, Terry. I appreciate that. Like you said, playing ball with them is not going to help. If you're on their radar, you're already on their radar. So I guess being cautious, but then also just making sure that you're still not letting it stop you from being community with others. Thank you both so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. We're so sorry about all the technical difficulties. I guess you would think that in the age of Zoom, we would have had it figured out by now. I guess we don't. But thank you to everyone for joining us and for tuning in. If you are enjoying the program and enjoying the film festival, please feel free to donate to CCF's. Our PayPal, our information is on our website and also in the emails that we're sending out. So please register at waronterrorfilmfestival.com so that you can receive those updates, and follow our social medias also at waronterrorfilmfestival.com, at WOTF Film Festival. Thank you all and have a great night. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to see everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, sir.